Welcome to Mindset Matters Book Club YouTube channel. Please subscribe and like to hear new book summaries.
It is so great to be here, and I have to say, we are tackling a subject today that, we spend roughly 25 to 30 years of our lives doing this, and yet most of us have absolutely no idea how it actually works.
Yeah, we are talking about sleep, and specifically, we are diving into that strange hallucinatory trick we take every single night called dreaming.
Which is such a wild concept when you really stop and think about it.
It is, because I think for a lot of people, myself included, there is still this this lingering feeling that sleep is just an off switch.
Right, like you just power down.
Exactly, like you park the car in the garage, you turn off the engine, the lights go out, and 8 hours later you turn the key again and you go about your day.
And that is the prevailing metaphor, right? The idea of complete dormancy. But the book we are deep diving into today completely shatters that image.
It really does.
It argues that when the lights go out, the factory actually kicks into high gear. The brain isn't resting in the way you might think it is.
No, not at all.
In some stages, it is actually burning more glucose and firing more intensely than when you are awake and trying to solve a complex calculus problem.
Which brings us to the book itself. We are exploring a fascinating book called The Brain Never Sleeps by Karen Van Kampen.
And that title really just says it all, doesn't it?
It is perfect. The mission of this deep dive is to explore the quote-unquote dark side of the mind. And she doesn't mean dark as in evil or scary.
No, she means the third of our lives that literally happens in the shadows in the dark of our bedrooms.
Exactly.
And Van Kampen takes us on this incredible journey from the old school psychoanalytic baggage of Freud, which we definitely have to address later, all the way to these cutting edge modern labs where scientists are literally communicating with people inside their dreams in real time.
Which sounds completely like science fiction, and we are absolutely going to get into that because it blew my mind.
It is wild stuff.
But before we get into the heavy neuroscience, I want to start with a story that the book actually opens with. It is a story about art, but it turns out it is actually a story about biology.
Yes, we need to go back to 1932 for this one.
The height of surrealism.
Exactly.
So Salvador Dali creates his famous painting, The Persistence of Memory.
The melting clocks.
Right, we all know this painting. The melting clocks draped over the tree branches, the barren landscape. It is basically the visual definition of dream logic.
It is iconic.
But what I found so fascinating in the book is that Dali wasn't just casually painting what he happened to remember from his dreams. He was actively hacking his brain to access them.
He was. He had this very specific, very deliberate ritual he called slumber with a key.
Slumber with a key, it sounds so poetic.
It does. But this is one of those anecdotes that people have told for decades as just a quirk of an eccentric artist, right?
Just Dali being Dali.
Right, but Van Kampen points out that he was actually performing a highly precise physiological experiment on himself long before we had the science to explain it.
So let us set the scene for the listener. Picture Dali in his studio. He is sitting in this heavy, bony Spanish armchair.
The room is completely quiet.
Right, very quiet. He tips his head back against the leather. He is trying to take a nap, but he is doing something very specific with his body posture.
His arms are resting on the arms of the chair, but his hands are deliberately dangling off the edges.
And in his left hand, he is holding a heavy, solid brass key.
Not gripping it, though, right?
No, he's holding it very delicately, just pinched lightly between his thumb and his forefinger. And directly underneath that hand, sitting on the bare wooden floorboards, is an upside-down porcelain plate.
It sounds like a prank setup, doesn't it? Like he is setting a trap for himself.
In a way, he kind of was. So he closes his eyes, he starts to drift, he enters that floaty, heavy feeling where your thoughts stop making linear sense.
The hypnagogic state.
Yes, he starts seeing images, maybe the melting clocks, maybe the elephants on those long, spindly stilts. But the specific goal is to catch what scientists now call the creative sweet spot.
Because what happens the exact millisecond? He actually falls asleep.
Muscle atonia.
Muscle atonia, exactly.
His body physically paralyzes itself as a safety mechanism as he slips into sleep. So his fingers relax. The key slips.
And bang, it hits the plate.
It hits the plate with a massive clang. The noise wakes him up instantly.
He snaps awake.
And in that split second, while the residue of the dream is still sticky and fresh in his mind, he grabs a pad and sketches exactly what he saw. He called them hand-painted dream photographs.
What Dali was doing, and what modern neuroscience is only now verifying, is that he was intentionally mining that hypnagogic transition zone. It is specifically called stage N1 sleep.
Right.
It is this incredibly fragile state where the brain loses its strict waking inhibitory control and starts making these wild, hyper-creative associations.
But you were still just close enough to wakefulness to yank yourself back and remember them if you were jolted.
He was biohacking his creativity 50 years before we had fMRI machines to show the blood flow in the brain.
And that is really the core theme of our deep dive today. We are taking these things that feel almost like magic or mysticism, things like dreams and bursts of creativity and nightmares, and we are lifting the hood to look at the hard biological machinery behind them.
And to do that properly, we need a really good guide. And Karen Van Kampen is an incredibly unique guide for this material.
Unique is definitely the right word. Usually when we read books about sleep science, they are written by academics who have spent their entire adult lives in university labs.
Safe and sterile environments.
Exactly. But Van Kampen's entry into this world is, well, it is a lot more visceral. It is very personal.
Personal is putting it mildly.
Yeah.
She didn't just study sleep. She was quite literally raised inside of a sleep lab.
She grew up in Oshawa, Ontario, and her father, Murray Moffat, was a sleep doctor. But before he was a sleep doctor, he was a coroner.
That specific career transition from coroner to sleep doctor is just so telling to me.
It really is.
As a coroner, he kept seeing these tragic cases of people dying mysteriously in their sleep. He would arrive at a death scene, and it would look like sudden heart failure. But the timing was always the same.
It always happened in the dark.
Right? It happened at night. So he became completely obsessed with this singular question: why do hearts stop specifically at night?
And that obsession basically turned their family home into a rigorous scientific laboratory.
It must have been such an intense way to grow up.
Van Kampen describes a childhood that sounds, on one hand, incredibly isolating, but on the other hand, absolutely fascinating. Her dad was so rigidly committed to sleep hygiene that the entire house was kept at exactly 68 degrees Fahrenheit at all times.
Which, for the record, we now know is the scientifically optimal temperature for sleep.
Right, the science backs him up, but for a young kid trying to play in the living room, it probably just felt freezing all the time. Cold and dark, too. There were heavy blackout blinds on every single window in the house.
And no normal reading material either.
No, instead of comic books or teen magazines, the house was just stacked with towering piles of the medical journal. Sleep everywhere you looked.
But the part that really stood out to me was that she wasn't just living in the lab. She was his primary test subject.
His live-in lab rat, essentially.
She has this vivid memory of being 9 years old sitting at the kitchen table. Her dad is mixing up this awful sticky white paste called collodion, and he is carefully gluing metal electrodes all over her scalp.
And the family dog is just sitting there watching her.
Yeah, she isn't upstairs playing with Barbies. She's downstairs getting wired up to a massive polysomnograph machine.
It gave her such a deep, intuitive baseline understanding of the science. She didn't learn about brainwaves by reading a textbook in her 20s.
No, she learned it by feeling the cold electrodes on her own skin and watching the literal ink pens scratch out her own brain's electrical activity.
There is this one story she shares in the book that I think perfectly captures the chaotic era she grew up in. Because we have to remember, this was way before everything was safely stored on hard drives or in the cloud.
Oh yeah, sleep records were entirely physical objects back then.
Exactly. We are talking about these massive accordion-folded stacks of graph paper, literally miles long, just to record a single night of sleep for one patient.
And those paper records were incredibly precious. They were the only existing copy of that patient's neurological data.
So she is helping her dad transport a huge batch of these critical records to a storage unit. They load up this old beat-up Jeep until the back suspension is visibly sagging under the weight of all this paper.
I can already see the disaster coming.
They are driving down this dark country road in the middle of the night. They are blaring Jane's Addiction on the radio, singing along. It's this rare, normal teenage bonding moment with her dad.
Yeah, man.
And then she feels a cold breeze hit the back of her neck.
Oh, no.
She looks in the rearview mirror and she realizes the trunk of the Jeep has popped wide open.
A total nightmare scenario.
And all she sees in the red glow of the taillights is just a massive blizzard of white paper violently flying out into the night sky.
Thousands of confidential medical records, specifically detailing the intimate sleep habits of real people just scattering into the wind.
It is so bad. They had to slam on the brakes, stop the Jeep on the side of this pitch black road, and spend hours literally wading through ditches and tall weeds in the dark, desperately chasing down these flying pages.
I really love that she included that image because it shows just how messy and incredibly tangible this science used to be. It wasn't just clean digital data points. It was physical paper flying through the air.
But despite growing up so immersed in that environment, she actually left the field entirely for a long time. She became a journalist. She covered completely different topics.
But something pulled her back.
Yes, she came back to the world of sleep because she happened to read a specific academic paper by Ruben Naiman. And the title of that paper was Dreamless, the Silent Epidemic of REM Sleep Loss.
That phrase, silent epidemic, carries so much weight.
It is incredibly ominous.
The central premise of that paper is what caught her attention. Because we talk constantly in our society about being sleep deprived, right? We all know we are tired. We all know we drink way too much coffee just to function.
It is practically a badge of honor for some people.
Right. But we almost never talk about being specifically dream deprived.
And there is a big difference.
A massive difference.
Right.
Because if we are artificially cutting our sleep short with alarm clocks, we're almost always cutting off the tail end of the night.
And that late morning sleep is where the vast majority of our REM sleep, our dream-heavy sleep, is concentrated. So we aren't just losing an hour of physical rest, we are systematically amputating this very specific biological process of dreaming from our daily lives.
And the really urgent question that launched this whole book is, what is the actual physiological and psychological cost of doing that?
Exactly. And to answer that, we first have to fundamentally understand what dreaming actually is.
Which historically has been a notoriously impossible question for science to answer.
Because for centuries, the absolute only way to study a dream was to wait for someone to wake up and just ask them to tell you about it.
And human beings are terrible witnesses.
Right.
We lie, we forget details, or we just unconsciously make things up to fill in the gaps.
Which means we really have to address the elephant in the room here. We have to talk about the Freud effect.
Yes, Sigmund Freud and his massive influential book, The Interpretation of Dreams.
You really cannot talk about the history of how we view dreams without talking about him.
For the entire first half of the 20th century, he completely dominated and dictated the conversation around sleep. His core view was that dreams were essentially repressed wishes.
The idea that the unconscious mind was this dark, mental junkyard of forbidden taboo desires.
Right, and dreams were simply the clever, disguised way that those unacceptable desires snuck out to play at night while our guard was down.
It was all based on this really intense, heavy symbolism.
Yeah.
Right? Like if you tell a psychoanalyst you dreamt of a snake, well, obviously that is a phallus.
Or if you dreamt of a house, then clearly that represents your mother.
It feels very arbitrary now.
Because it was. It was basically applying literary criticism to biology. And while it was culturally massive and shaped modern art and literature, it fundamentally was not science.
Because it wasn't falsifiable.
Exactly. You couldn't run an experiment to prove Freud wrong, because literally everything was open to subjective interpretation. The real turning point, the shift from subjective interpretation to objective physiological measurement, is where the true story of this book begins.
And that turning point happens in 1953.
In a basement.
In a very dingy, very dark basement laboratory at the University of Chicago.
This brings us to the story of Eugene Azarinsky.
And reading this particular chapter, I have to say I really felt for the guy. He is basically the ultimate scientific underdog.
He really is. He wasn't some prestigious, well-funded professor. He was a broke, older graduate student struggling to feed his family.
And he came from an incredibly rough background.
The detail about his father, Boris, really got me. His dad was a dentist, but he had this severe gambling problem.
To the point where he would literally melt down the gold from his own patients' dental fillings just to pay off his gambling debts.
So Eugene grew up with this very scrappy, hyper-vigilant, street-smart survivalist mentality. He was not a silver spoon academic.
So he is at the university working under Nathaniel Kleitman, and Kleitman is basically the big cheese, the undisputed godfather of early sleep research.
But Kleitman doesn't give Azarinsky the glamorous work. He hands him the absolute lowest grunt work imaginable.
He wants Azarinsky to sit in a room and manually observe the eye movements of sleeping infants.
Which, if you know anything about babies, is a logistical nightmare.
Yeah.
Babies are incredibly hard to work with in a controlled setting.
So Azarinsky, being scrappy, decides to automate the process. He decides to use an EEG machine to measure the electrical activity near the eyes instead.
But again, he has no funding. This wasn't some sleek modern computer.
No, this was a giant, ancient, dusty machine that he literally dragged out of a basement storage closet. It used actual ink pens scratching back and forth on these massive, endless rolls of paper.
So he gets the machine working, but now he needs a test subject. And since he has absolutely zero budget to pay volunteers, who does he recruit?
His own son, Armand, who is 8 years old.
I mean, can you even imagine that conversation today? Hey, son, come down to this creepy windowless basement at the university so Dad can glue wires to your face while you sleep.
It sounds absolutely terrifying, but little Armand agrees to do it. So let's picture the scene. It is very late at night. The basement is completely silent.
Armand is lying on a small cot, fast asleep.
And as Rinsky is sitting under a dim light, just watching the machine hum, probably stressing out about his unpaid bills, the ink pens are making these very slow, very rolling, predictable marks.
Because that is what a brain in deep sleep looks like on paper.
Right, it is very calm. But then suddenly, out of nowhere, absolute chaos.
The pens just go completely wild.
They start scratching furiously back and forth across the paper. The pattern it is drawing looks identically like a fully awake, alert brain. High-frequency, low-amplitude waves?
Aserinsky looks at the paper, ripping through the machine. And his immediate thought is, well, obviously the machine is broken.
Or the kid is woken up.
Right, so he rushes into the dark room, fully expecting to see Armand sitting up in bed, maybe looking around or rubbing his eyes.
But he finds the boy soundly asleep, breathing heavily. But as he leans in closer, he notices something under the dim light.
Underneath the boy's closed eyelids, his eyeballs are darting violently back and forth. Left, right, left, right.
He goes back out to the machine. The pens are still scratching away, indicating an awake brain. He goes back and watches the eyes darting again.
And in that moment, it hits him.
The brain is awake, but the boy is deeply asleep.
This was the official scientific discovery of REM sleep, rapid eye movement.
It was a massive paradigm shift, because before that specific night in 1953, the entire scientific community assumed the brain simply powered down like a light bulb.
Aserinsky proved that there is this bizarre paradoxical state where the physical body is paralyzed and deeply, deeply asleep, but the inner brain is burning just as hot and as active as it is during the middle of the day.
It completely destroyed the old passive theory of sleep. But there's a part of this story that just absolutely breaks my heart.
It is a very tough ending.
You would think that making a discovery of that magnitude, Aserinsky would immediately become a legend. You would think he would get tenure, be on the cover of magazines, get massive grants.
But history and science is rarely that kind to the pioneers. Aserinsky and Kleitman published their findings in a 1953 paper in the journal Science.
And today, that paper is universally considered one of the most important physiological discoveries of the entire 20th century.
But shortly after it was published, Aserinsky actually quit sleep research entirely.
Why would he walk away from his own landmark discovery?
It came down to money. He simply could not support his struggling family on a meager researcher's stipend. He was desperate.
So he took a totally unrelated government job.
Yes, he took a job with the Bureau of Fisheries doing clerical work, literally counting salmon.
Counting salmon. The man who discovered the physiological key to the dream world spent his prime years counting fish.
And, tragically, it gets much sadder. His wife suffered from very severe untreated depression and eventually committed suicide. Aserinsky's own later life was marked by deep bitterness and tragedy.
Van Kampen includes this entire backstory not just to depress us, but to really ground the science. These massive paradigm-shifting discoveries aren't just sterile facts printed in a textbook. They are the direct result of intense, messy human struggle.
Aserinsky handed humanity the foundational map to our own unconscious minds, but he completely struggled to navigate his own life.
That is a very heavy realization. But his basement discovery absolutely set the stage for everything that followed in the field.
It did. And for decades after Aserinsky, the golden rule in sleep science was very simple. REM sleep equals dreaming.
That became the unbreakable dogma. If you are in REM, you are dreaming. If you are not in REM, you are strictly not dreaming.
It was a very neat, very tidy equation that everyone accepted.
But as the book shows, science really hates tidy equations. Someone always comes along to break them. Enter Mark Solms.
Solms is such a fascinating figure in this narrative. He's a neuropsychoanalyst, which is a massive mouthful of a job title.
What does that even mean, practically?
Essentially, he tries to map the old abstract psychological concepts of Freud onto modern physical brain anatomy. And while doing this, he started noticing a pattern that completely contradicted the established REM equals dreaming dogma.
He was focusing on lesion studies, right? Looking at patients who had specific localized brain damage.
Exactly. This is historically how a lot of neuroscience actually advances. You observe what breaks in a patient, and by process of elimination, you figure out what that specific broken part of the brain was supposed to be doing.
So Solms looked at patients who had very specific damage to the brainstem, specifically a region called the pons.
Now, neurologically speaking, the pons is the physical switch that turns on REM sleep.
Okay, so logically, if the pons is broken by a stroke or an injury, that patient physically cannot enter the state of REM sleep.
Correct. When hooked up to the monitors, their eyes never darted back and forth. Their muscles never experienced atonia. So according to the dogma, they should never, ever experience another dream.
But they did.
They absolutely did. They woke up and reported intensely vivid, highly complex narrative dreams.
Stuff like, I dreamt my cousin turned into a toaster while we were driving a bus.
Exactly. Classic bizarre dream scenarios. But the machines proved they had absolutely zero REM physical activity.
So right there, that completely shatters rule number 1. It proves you can have vivid dreams without being in REM sleep.
And then Solms looked at the exact flip side of the equation. He studied a different group of patients who had localized damage much higher up in the forebrain.
And what happened with them?
These patients had perfectly healthy brainstem, so they had flawless physical REM cycles. Their eyes darted rapidly. The machine showed all the correct high-frequency waves.
So they are physiologically textbook REM sleeping.
But when woken up, they reported a complete and total cessation of all dreaming. Just a blank, dark void every single night.
Oh, wow. So you can have REM without dreams, and you can have dreams without REM. They are two completely distinct systems running in parallel.
They are what neurologists call doubly dissociated. And realizing this led Solms on a hunt to identify the actual true engine that generates dreams. If it wasn't the brainstem REM switch, what was it?
And he found it was actually the dopamine pathway, specifically the mesolimbic dopamine system.
Let us unpack that because that is huge. When we normally hear the word dopamine in pop culture, we usually associate it with negative things like addiction or mindlessly scrolling on smartphones.
Right, we call it the reward chemical.
But neurologically, it is more accurately described as the seeking chemical. It is the primitive evolutionary system that drives our motivation, our exploration, our intense desire to engage with the environment.
It is the urge to do things.
Exactly. And Solms discovered that this specific seeking system is absolutely hyperactive during the dreaming process.
Okay, wait. If the act of dreaming is being powered by the brain's fundamental seeking system, what does that actually say about what a dream fundamentally is?
This is the mind-bending part. It suggests that dreams are not just random neurological static or meaningless noise. Solms argues that dreams are intentional, motivated, meaningful states of volition.
Even when we are lying completely paralyzed in a dark room, our brain is being driven by this intense chemical urge to go out and actively engage with a simulated world.
We don't just passively watch dreams happen to us. We dream because, on a deep chemical level, we actively want something.
That completely changes the framing. It makes dreaming feel so much more active. It is not a late-night movie we are sitting through. It is a complex simulation we are intentionally running because we are starved for experience.
Precisely. And understanding that incredible level of brain activity leads us directly to how the entire night is physically structured. Because as the brain is doing all this heavy lifting, how does it organize its schedule?
Van Kampen breaks down the actual architecture of sleep, and it is way more structured than just drifting off and staying there.
It is an intricate cycle, right? We go through these 90-minute loops over and over again.
And she uses this great analogy of descending a staircase to describe the NREM stages, the non-REM sleep.
Right, so stage 1, N1, is the top step of the stairs.
That is the drifting phase we talked about with Dolly and his key. You are producing alpha and theta waves.
Then you step down to stage 2, which is a slightly deeper light sleep. This is where the EEG shows these sudden quick bursts of electrical activity called sleep spindles.
And then you keep going down until you hit the absolute bottom of the stairs. Stage 3.
Deep sleep, also known as slow wave sleep.
This is the heavy coma-like sleep.
Absolutely. If I walk into your room and try to wake you up during stage 3, you'll be incredibly groggy. You probably won't know where you are or what year it is for a minute.
Because your brain waves have slowed all the way down to these massive rolling delta waves.
But this stage is crucial. This is the purely restorative phase. This is when the brain's internal janitorial staff clocks in for their shift.
The glymphatic system.
Yes, the brain literally physically shrinks a tiny bit and flushes cerebrospinal fluid through the tissues to wash out the metabolic waste and toxic proteins that actively built up while you were awake and thinking all day.
So if you aren't getting enough deep, slow wave sleep, your brain is quite literally physically dirty. The trash is just piling up inside your skull.
Exactly. But then after the floors are scrubbed clean,
right,
we don't just stay down there. We run all the way back up the stairs.
And that is when we hit REM sleep, the paradoxical sleep.
And Van Kampen does a great job explaining exactly why it is called paradoxical. because if a doctor just looks at the brain scan without looking at your body, the brain appears fully wide awake.
The limbic system, which is the deep emotional center, is just screaming. It is wildly highly active.
But the prefrontal cortex, which is the part of your brain that normally says, hang on, that doesn't make logical sense, or maybe I shouldn't do that in public, that logical filter is dialed completely way down.
Which perfectly explains dream logic. It explains why you can be standing at a dinner party chatting with a talking giraffe and your old third-grade math teacher, and your brain just accepts it and says, please pass the salt.
You accept the bizarre reality completely because your internal logic filter is offline.
But the intense emotion is fully online.
That is the dangerous combination.
Yeah.
Right? High, unregulated emotion mixed with very low logic. And because that is such a wild mental state, there has to be a physical safety feature in place.
Which brings us back to the paralysis, the atonia.
The brainstem releases very specific neurotransmitters, mainly glycine and GABA, down the spinal cord to completely paralyze your major voluntary muscle group.
So you don't actually try to physically act out the intense ninja fight you are currently dreaming about?
But sometimes in some people, that vital chemical switch actually fails. And the consequences of that are truly terrifying.
The book dedicates some time to explaining parasomnias, specifically REM behavior disorder.
It is a very serious and dangerous medical condition. The paralysis mechanism just completely breaks down. So the person is deep in a dream, vividly fighting off an attacker or running away. And in reality, in their bedroom, they are physically punching the drywall or violently kicking their spouse or literally diving out of bed onto the floor.
They are acting out the dream in real physical space.
Yes, they're living the dream physically.
Now, is that essentially the same mechanism as sleepwalking? Because people always confuse the two.
No, they are entirely different, and that is a very common misconception. True sleepwalking rarely happens during REM. It usually happens down in the deep NREM slow wave sleep at the very bottom of the stairs.
So what is actually happening in the brain of a sleepwalker then?
It is what neurologists describe as a mixed brain state. The brain isn't fully asleep or fully awake. The motor cortex, the part that actively commands your legs to walk, is awake and firing.
But the consciousness, the actual you, is still deeply asleep.
Right. It is functionally much closer to a zombie state than a vivid dream state. A sleepwalker can flawlessly navigate around a dark room. They can open a fridge and take a bite out of a stick of butter, but there is no internal narrative running in their head. They aren't dreaming about eating butter. They're just automatically doing it.
Which is so strange to think about.
It just perfectly illustrates how incredibly complex and modular the brain is. Whole sections of it can be walking around the house while the consciousness remains completely powered down.
So we have explored the heavy machinery. We know the cycles, the stages, the chemicals involved. But the massive overarching question, the one that Van Kampen keeps circling back to throughout the book, is simply why?
The evolutionary why.
Right. Why does human evolution demand that we spend roughly 2 solid hours every single night in a completely paralyzed, highly hallucinating, vulnerable state? It seems incredibly dangerous. Out on the savannah, a predator could just walk up and eat you.
It is a massive biological vulnerability, a huge evolutionary risk.
Right.
So the payoff for taking that risk must be astronomically high. The book primarily focuses on 2 major theories to explain this: therapy and memory.
Let us start with the therapy theory first, because I found this incredibly profound. This is the sleep to forget, sleep to remember hypothesis.
This specific framework comes from researchers Matthew Walker and Els van der Helm. And the metaphor they use to explain it is just absolutely brilliant. They ask you to think about an orange.
Okay, an orange.
The sweet fruit inside the orange represents the actual information, the factual memory of what happened during an event. But the thick, bitter rind on the outside represents the raw, visceral, gut-punch emotion associated with that event.
So for example, let us say I get into a massive screaming argument with a good friend. My heart is racing, I feel sick to my stomach, my hands are shaking. That physical feeling is the bitter rind.
Exactly. That is the hot, reactive emotion. Now, the problem is you cannot properly digest the fruit of the experience while that bitter emotional rind is still tightly wrapped around it. It is too painful to process logically. You just endlessly ruminate and panic.
So what exactly does sleep do to fix that?
During REM sleep, the chemical bath inside your brain dramatically changes. Most importantly, the brain supply of noradrenaline, which is a major stress and anxiety molecule, is completely shut off.
It drops to 0.
It is the only time in the entire 24-hour biological cycle that your brain is completely free of this specific stress chemical.
It creates a perfectly safe internal zone.
Yes, so inside this calm, safe neurochemical bath, your brain deliberately brings up the painful memory of the fight. It replays it. But without the noradrenaline firing, it gently begins to peel away that bitter rind. It chemically strips the raw emotion away from the factual information.
So when I wake up the next morning, I still perfectly remember the fight. I know exactly what harsh words were said, but my heart isn't racing and I don't feel like throwing up anymore. I can actually think about it rationally.
You retain the wisdom, but you lose the active wound. That is a primary function of dreaming. It is literally overnight emotional convalescence.
And this isn't just a metaphor, right? They actually proved this mechanically.
They absolutely proved it using MRI scans. They showed people highly disturbing emotional images and tracked the fear center firing. Then half the people slept and half stayed awake. The next day, they showed them the images again.
And the people who slept were calmer.
Much calmer. The MRI showed their amygdala barely reacted the second time. The rind was peeled. But the people who stayed awake, their amygdala fired just as hot and panicked as the very first time. The wound was still fresh.
That is incredible to realize. We are literally actively shrinking our emotional baggage every single night while we sleep. But the book does mention a very dark, very tragic exception to this process.
Yes, PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder.
How does PTSD break this system?
In a brain suffering from PTSD, this specific emotional peeling mechanism completely fails. The brain tries to process the horrific trauma, but for complex reasons, the noradrenaline valve doesn't fully shut off during REM.
So the chemical bath isn't safe at all.
No, the stress chemical is still flooding the brain. So the brain brings up the traumatic memory, tries to peel the orange, but the rind simply will not come off.
So instead of processing it, you just experience the nightmare. You replay the raw trauma at full emotional volume.
And because the stress chemical is present, the emotional charge is never reduced. You wake up sweating and terrified, and the memory is just as hot and damaging as it was the day it happened. It is basically a broken internal therapy session that just endlessly, tragically repeats itself.
That perfectly biologically explains why recurring vivid nightmares are such a universal hallmark of PTSD. It is the brain desperately trying to do its nightly job and biologically failing.
Exactly. Now that covers the therapy aspect. The second major theory the book explores is about memory consolidation. The process of physically moving newly acquired information from temporary short-term storage into permanent long-term storage.
Van Kampen uses a really helpful analogy here about a librarian.
Right. So think of a brain structure called the hippocampus as the very busy librarian, and the massive neocortex is the vast permanent library itself.
Okay.
During your waking day, you are constantly learning a million tiny new things. Oh, that guy's name is Steve, or hey, don't touch that hot stove pan. All of that temporary daily data goes straight to the hippocampus. It is essentially your mental inbox.
But just like an email inbox, it has very limited capacity. It gets full fast.
If you don't clear that temporary inbox, you physically cannot retain any new information the next day. You max out. So during sleep, specifically, during the spindle bursts and slow-wave sleep, the librarian grabs all those files from the temporary desk and physically wires them into the permanent stacks of the neocortex.
Which clears off the desk so you can learn new things tomorrow. And this specific process leads to one of the absolute coolest experiments detailed in the entire book, the Tetris effect.
Oh, Robert Stickgold's famous study. This is a classic.
He had his research subjects come into the lab and play the old video game Tetris for hours on end, just staring at a screen, dropping colored blocks, clearing lines.
Right. Or in a variation of the study, they played Alpine Racer, which was an arcade game simulating downhill skiing.
Just highly repetitive spatial tasks. And then when these subjects finally went to sleep, he would wake them up in the early stages and simply ask, what is going through your mind right now?
And predictably, they all reported seeing geometric blocks falling behind their eyelids or feeling the distinct physical swaying motion of skiing down a mountain.
But he didn't just do this with regular college students, right? He did this with a very specific group of patients, and this is the part that completely blew my mind.
This is the critical piece of the puzzle. He ran the exact same experiment using patients who suffered from anterograde amnesia.
These are people who physically cannot form any new conscious memories?
Exactly. Their hippocampus is damaged. So they sat in the lab and played Tetris all day long. But if the researcher walked out of the room and came back an hour later and asked them, hey, have you ever played a game called Tetris? They would genuinely answer no. What is Tetris? I've never seen that before.
They have absolutely zero conscious episodic memory of the entire day.
None at all. But when Stick Gold let these amnesiacs fall asleep and woke them up to ask what they were seeing, they reported the exact same thing. They told him, I keep seeing these weird shapes turning and falling down.
Even though they had no conscious idea why they were seeing them.
Right, they were totally confused by the imagery.
That is just wild. It means the brain is stubbornly learning the patterns and rules of the environment, even if the conscious narrative mind has literally no idea what is happening.
It absolutely proves that the brain processes implicit or procedural memories completely separate from episodic story memories. Your brain is desperately trying to extract the rules of the game to help you survive tomorrow, whether the conscious you actually remembers playing the game or not.
Which naturally brings us right back to the idea of creativity. Because if the sleeping brain is down there endlessly shuffling all these random daily memories around and trying to find hidden patterns, it is eventually bound to make some really weird, unexpected connections.
And that is the third major function of dreaming discussed in the book: creativity. Stickgold coined a fantastic acronym for this process. He calls it NXTUP.
NXTEU, Network Exploration to Understand Possibilities.
It does sound a bit like a corporate seminar buzzword, but the underlying neurological concept is incredibly profound.
How does NXTUP actually work in practice?
Think about it like this. When you are fully awake, your brain prioritizes being highly logical and efficient. If I say the word sun to you right now, your awake brain immediately jumps to the strongest, most obvious associations. You think hot or star or light.
Right. It is efficient. I don't want my brain to think sun equals toaster when I'm trying to safely drive a car in traffic. I need the obvious answers.
Exactly. Waking survival demands strong, obvious associations. But during REM sleep, those strict logical efficiency filters are turned completely off. The brain shifts gears and starts deliberately searching for the absolute weakest, most distant associations it can find. It starts endlessly asking, what if?
It connects dots that are miles apart.
Yes, it connects sun to, say, a chocolate chip cookie simply because they happen to share the geometric shape of being round. Or it connects the concept of a tree to the concept of human veins.
It is finding the hidden architecture between totally unrelated things because the waking logic gatekeeper is asleep.
There was a brilliant psychological study mentioned in the book that proved this using the concept of a tree.
How did they do it?
They asked awake subjects to list immediate word associations with the word tree, and predictably they got very standard, boring answers. Leaf branch, bark green.
The strong associations.
Right. Then they selectively woke up subjects who were right in the middle of actively dreaming about trees and asked them the same question.
And what did the dreamers say?
The answers were entirely bizarre and poetic. They described personified trees with faces, roots that pulsed like human blood vessels, trees made of glass.
They accessed a totally different vocabulary.
But here is the absolute kicker of the study. Later that day, they gave all the subjects creative problem-solving tasks that tangentially involved those concepts. And the people who had been woken up from the dream state were significantly, demonstrably better at solving the lateral thinking puzzles.
Because their brain had spent the night widening the associative network. They had already explored the weird possibilities in the dark.
And this realization brings us perfectly full circle right back to Salvador Dali in his armchair. We now have hard, peer-reviewed scientific proof that his weird slumber with a key trick actually works.
And a researcher named Celia Lacow actually replicated Dali's exact method in a modern lab setting.
Yes, she wanted to test the hypnagogic sweet spot empirically.
Did she actually have the subjects hold a brass key?
She updated it slightly. She had them hold a plastic bottle. But the physical principle was identical. She gave her subjects a very tedious math problem to solve. But hidden inside the math problem was a secret mathematical rule, a hidden shortcut.
So if you subconsciously notice the hidden shortcut, you bypass all the tedious work and solve it instantly.
Right. So she has them try it, then she puts them in a dark room and tells them to let themselves drift off to sleep while holding this plastic bottle over the floor.
Trying to catch that fragile N1 stage.
Exactly. When their muscles paralyzed as they fell asleep, they dropped the bottle. The noise jolted them awake, and she immediately handed them the math problem again.
And what were the results compared to people who just stayed awake?
The results were staggering. The people who hit that precise M1 sweet spot and were immediately woken up were exactly 3 times more likely to suddenly figure out the hidden mathematical shortcut.
3 times. That is not a small statistical bump. That is a massive cognitive advantage.
Dali wasn't just being a quirky weirdo for the cameras. He was meticulously optimizing his physiological brain state. He was routinely accessing a fluid, hyper-associative mode of human processing that the rest of us just mindlessly sleep right through every single night.
So we have extensively explored the history, the underlying biology, the emotional therapy, and the raw creativity of sleep. But in the final chapters, Van Kampen takes the book in a direction that looks entirely at the future.
And this is exactly where the science starts to feel genuinely a bit like a sci-fi thriller.
We are talking about the absolute frontier, lucid dreaming, and the concept of dream engineering.
Let us define lucid dreaming first. It is simply the state where you suddenly realize you are currently in a dream while the dream is actively happening.
The moment of realization where you say, wait a minute, I can fly right now, so obviously this must be a dream.
Exactly. Now, for a very long time, mainstream scientists couldn't strictly study this phenomenon because it was entirely subjective. They just had to sit around, wait for a person to wake up and trust whatever story they told them.
There was no objective proof it was happening in real time.
Until Ken Powler's laboratory, Northwestern University, completely changed the game.
This specific experiment is easily one of the most mind-bending things I have ever read. They managed to establish two-way real-time communication with a person who is deeply asleep.
It sounds impossible, but they did it.
How exactly do you talk to someone whose brain is shut off to the outside world?
They utilized the one part of the body that isn't paralyzed during REM sleep, the eyes. Because remember, your eyes are frantically darting around under your lids.
Rapid eye movement.
Right. So they trained a highly skilled lucid dreamer, a guy named Christopher Mazurek, to use his physical eye movements like a signaling device. Specifically, looking hard left, then right, then left, then right was a predetermined signal that meant, hey, researchers, I am currently lucid inside the dream.
Like using Morse code from another dimension.
That is exactly what it is. So they hook him up to the EEG machines and wait. He falls deep under. The machines verify 100% that he is physiologically locked in deep REM sleep. Then he signals left, right, left, right.
He is awake inside the dream. So what do the researchers do?
While he is sleeping, they play a soft audio cue into the room. A voice asks him a simple math problem out loud. What is 8 minus 6?
And he actually hears the audio from the real world penetrating into his dream environment.
He hears it, integrates it, and inside the dream he calculates the answer. Then he physically moves his eyes to signal the answer back out to the waking world. 1, 2.
2. That honestly gives me chills to even think about. The man is medically asleep. His consciousness is wandering around in a totally manufactured hallucinatory reality. But he is hearing a voice from our baseline reality, doing cognitive math and beaming a signal back across the barrier.
It completely broke the wall. It definitively proved that the sleeping mind is not hermetically sealed off from the outside world. And neuroscientist Ben Baird did subsequent research that perfectly explains how this is biologically possible.
What did he find?
He found that during a lucid dream, the prefrontal cortex, the logic and self-awareness center we talked about earlier, actually physically reactivates slightly. The lights turn back on in the command center just enough to allow for critical self-reflective thought while the rest of the brain continues to hallucinate.
But this incredible breakthrough leads to a very slippery slope. Because if we can directly communicate with dreamers, if we can reach into their minds while they sleep, then naturally someone is going to try to influence or control what they are dreaming about.
And that brings us to the emerging field of dream engineering.
Which feels like a total double-edged sword.
It really is. On the positive side, the potential for healing is incredible. They have done studies where they release specific scents, like the smell of fresh roses, into a room while people are sleeping to dramatically improve their performance on memory tasks the next day.
Because the specific smell triggers the hippocampus to prioritize consolidating those specific memories.
Yes, it cues the brain. So hypothetically, you could learn a foreign language much faster if you smell a specific cue while you study and then smell that same cue while you sleep.
Or therapeutically, you could potentially guide a severe PTSD nightmare toward a safe, positive resolution without the patient having to consciously suffer through it.
The medical applications are beautiful, but there is a very, very dark corporate side to this kind.
Targeted dream incubation.
Yes, advertising agencies are aggressively looking at this exact science. Imagine a massive beverage company like Coors Light paying to inject the crisp sound of a cracking aluminum can or the distinct smell of hops into your smart speaker while you sleep, simply to manipulate you into dreaming about drinking their beer.
That is genuinely terrifying. The idea that my own private subconscious dreams could legally contain corporate product placement.
It raises massive, unprecedented ethical questions. Sleep has always been the absolute last private sanctuary of the human experience. It is the one single place where we are entirely alone with our own raw thoughts, safely away from screens and billboards.
If we legally open that intimate door to engineers and marketers, are we even remotely ready for what comes creeping in?
It is a question society is going to have to answer very soon. But I will say Van Kampen makes sure to end the book on a much more empowering and grounded note.
She does. She wraps up by talking about a fascinating biological concept called interoception.
The quote-unquote eighth sense.
Right. We all know the basic external senses: sight, sound, touch, taste, smell. But interoception is the internal ability to consciously physically sense the ongoing internal state of your own body.
Feeling your own heartbeat accelerating, noticing the exact sensation of hunger in your stomach, or feeling the tight physical knot of anxiety forming in your chest.
And her big concluding argument is that our dreams are fundamentally a powerful form of interoception.
Yes, she frames dreams as a vital, built-in warning system, like the warning lights on a car dashboard.
So if you are consistently having intense nightmares or repetitive stress dreams where all your teeth suddenly fall out or you keep desperately missing a flight at the airport,
that is your physical body quite literally keeping the score. It is an internal diagnostic signal actively warning you that something is physiologically or psychologically out of balance in your waking life.
So instead of just waving our dreams away as random weird nonsense over breakfast, we should actively be attending to them.
Precisely. Keep a journal on your nightstand. Write down the fragments as soon as you wake up. Listen closely to what the internal data is desperately trying to tell you.
Yeah.
Because as Stickgold puts it, dreaming is a freebie.
A freebie.
Yes, it is free, nightly, unvarnished insight into the actual state of your own mind and body. You just have to be willing to look at it.
I really love that perspective. So having digested all of this dense material, having read The Brain Never Sleeps cover to cover, what is the one overarching thing that really sticks with you from this deep dive?
For me, honestly, it is just the total profound shift in perspective. I genuinely used to think of sleep as just a frustrating, necessary timeout from my real life. Now I clearly see it as an incredibly active, vital tune-up. It's arguably the most biologically productive part of my entire day.
Right, the factory is doing the real work in the dark.
Exactly. But I also really can't shake that heavy philosophical question we touched on about solitude.
Which part exactly?
Well, if the science is progressing so fast that we can now easily communicate with lucid dreamers, if we can literally beam math problems into the void and get a calculated cognitive answer back from a sleeping mind,
Yeah.
are we basically standing on the verge of the complete end of human solitude? If the absolute deepest layers of our dream space can be technically breached and communicated with, where exactly do we go to be truly, truly alone?
Wow. That is incredibly haunting. That is definitely something heavy for all of us to think about tonight when we turn out the lights and close our eyes.
I will certainly be thinking about it.
This has been an incredibly eye-opening deep dive into the book The Brain Never Sleeps by Karen Van Kampen. It is a fascinating, slightly terrifying, but ultimately deeply illuminating look at the literal night shift of the human brain.
I highly, highly recommend picking up a copy and reading it for yourself. I promise it will permanently change the way you think about going to sleep.
Thank you so much for listening to the Mindset Matters Book Club YouTube channel. Seriously, go buy a notebook, put it right next to your bed, and maybe if you were feeling adventurous, try holding a brass key tonight when you drift off. Just make sure you put a ceramic plate down first.
Yes, definitely protect your hardwood floors.
Exactly. Thanks for joining us, everyone.